Consider a chilling possibility. What if the very systems we've built to select our leaders are fundamentally wired to choose the worst possible candidates? Imagine stepping into the corridors of power, a corporate headquarters or a legislative assembly, only to find that the individual wielding the most influence is, by any sane measure, the one least fit to lead. Could it be that our methods for granting authority are not just flawed, but dangerously inverted? Cast your gaze across the global landscape of politics and industry, and you'll notice a persistent, unsettling pattern. Take the case of Richard Nixon, a man who ascended to the summit of global influence, the American presidency, only to see his power crumble under the weight of the Watergate scandal. Despite his sharp intellect and vast experience, Nixon's deep-seated paranoia, his comfort with deception, and his elastic sense of morality ultimately engineered his ruin. Yet these were the very same qualities, his brutal pragmatism and his readiness to disregard the rules, that fueled his relentless climb to the top. Nearly half a millennium ago, Niccolò Machiavelli witnessed this exact dynamic unfold in the cutthroat world of Renaissance Italy. In his legendary and often feared treatise, The Prince, he penned a stark observation. Men in general judge more by the eyes than by the hands, for everyone can see you, but few can touch you. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. In essence, when it comes to power, perception is reality. Machiavelli wasn't promoting a culture of deceit. He was diagnosing an uncomfortable truth about the human condition and the architecture of power, a truth that modern science has since validated. Groundbreaking research in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology has shown that individuals who project extreme self-confidence are consistently seen as more competent, even when their actual skills and knowledge are completely lacking. Today, we're going to dissect this paradox. We will explore why our leadership structures so often reward the very traits that should be disqualifying: narcissism, dishonesty, and even a calculated brand of foolishness. We'll see how Machiavelli's 16th century insights align with what 21st century psychology now confirms about our behavior. But we won't stop there. We will also examine the exceptions, the remarkable leaders and organizations that have successfully broken this dangerous mold, and what their stories can teach us. The allure of the narcissist. A prince must consider how to avoid those things which make him hated or contemptible. It makes him contemptible to be considered fickle, frivolous, effeminate, mean-spirited, irresolute, from all of which a prince should guard himself as from a reef. When Machiavelli wrote these words, he was tapping into a profound element of leadership. Our institutions reward those who project an image of absolute, unwavering resolve. In today's terms, this gives narcissistic individuals a powerful, often insurmountable advantage in the competition for leadership. Visualize this scenario. You're part of a group, hopelessly lost in a dense, unfamiliar forest. The canopy overhead blocks out the sun, and a sense of unease is setting in. Two figures emerge from the group to offer guidance. The first one says, "I have a good sense of direction, and I think this is the way out, but I can't be 100% certain. There are a few paths we could try." The second one points decisively and declares, "The way out is that way. I am certain. Follow me now." Even though the first person is offering a more honest assessment of the inherent uncertainty, which is the only truthful position in that situation, most groups will instinctively rally behind the second person. Have you witnessed this dynamic in your own life, at work, in your community? That magnetic pull toward confident certainty, even when it's an illusion? a sweeping meta-analysis in personnel psychology, which reviewed 54 different studies, dissected the link between narcissism and leadership. It found that the traits that get narcissists hired, their supreme self-belief, charismatic presentations, and grandiose visions, are rarely the same traits that lead to effective governance once they are in power. In fact, companies with narcissistic CEOs suffer from 27% more performance volatility and are 33% more likely to face severe negative market reactions to their strategic moves. Think of Adam Neumann, the former CEO of WeWork. He masterfully persuaded savvy investors to pour billions into his office-sharing company, achieving a staggering $47 billion valuation, despite hemorrhaging money. His larger-than-life vision and unshakable confidence were seductive. But those same traits led to the company's spectacular implosion, with its valuation plummeting by over 80% when his extravagant promises collided with financial reality. The psychology here is elegantly simple. We are hardwired to be drawn to confidence, especially when we feel uncertain. Research confirms that individuals who display confidence, even when they are demonstrably wrong, achieve a higher social status than those who express doubt. As one psychologist starkly put it, we prefer confidence to accuracy. Machiavelli saw this clearly, noting that nothing makes a prince so much esteemed as great enterprises and setting a fine example. The appearance of greatness, it seems, is often more valuable than greatness itself. Yet, this is not a universal law. Consider the legacy of Sir Seretse Khama, the first president of Botswana. He transformed his nation from one of the poorest on the African continent into one of its most stable, prosperous, and enduring democracies. Unlike so many of his post-colonial peers who built cults of personality, Khama governed with a quiet humility and a fierce pragmatism, focusing on building strong institutions, not personal power. Under his watch, Botswana's GDP exploded from $69 million in 1966 to over $8.4 billion by 2000, while life expectancy soared. His story is a powerful testament that while narcissism can be a shortcut to power, true leadership is forged from integrity, stability, and a genuine commitment to the people you serve. When you think about the leaders who have truly made a positive difference, do you see this distinction between the traits that help them gain power versus the traits that help them wield it wisely? The strategic value of deception. Everyone admits how praiseworthy it is in a prince to keep his word and to behave with integrity rather than cunning. Nevertheless, our experience has been that those princes who have done great things have held keeping their word of little account, and have known how to beguile men's minds by shrewdness and cunning. This is arguably Machiavelli's most notorious piece of advice. Modern sensibilities are often jolted by his seemingly cold endorsement of dishonesty. But to understand him is to see that he wasn't championing lying as a moral good. He was making an empirical observation about which tactics prevail in the brutal arena of power. Effective deception in leadership rarely involves outright, provable lies. It functions more like a masterful stage illusion. Imagine a magician. The dramatic flourish of his right hand mesmerizes you, drawing your entire focus while his left hand is quietly executing the secret mechanics of the trick. Leaders in politics and business use the same principle of misdirection. They spotlight flattering statistics and positive trends while deftly concealing the unfavorable data in the shadows. Think about the leaders you've worked with or observed. How often have they skillfully directed your gaze toward what they wanted you to see, rather than what you needed to see? The psychological mechanism that makes this so effective is fascinating. We humans are susceptible to what behavioral economists call optimism bias. We have a natural tendency to interpret ambiguous information in a way that confirms our hopes and desires. It's a cognitive filter that favors what we want to be true. Leaders who grasp this can craft messages that are intentionally vague, allowing different people to hear exactly what they want to hear. Consider the language of corporate communications. Losses are rebranded as strategic investments. A minor product update is framed as a breakthrough success. Research from the University of Michigan demonstrates that leaders who frame challenges in a positive light can boost employee morale and productivity by as much as 31%, even when the objective reality of the situation is grim. Machiavelli captured this perfectly. In the actions of all men, and especially of princes, one looks to the end. So let a prince win and maintain his state. The means will always be judged honorable and will be praised by everyone. But not all organizations play this game. Patagonia, under the guidance of its founder Yvon Chouinard, built its entire brand on a foundation of radical transparency. They openly published reports on the environmental harm caused by their own products and ran audacious ad campaigns like, "Don't buy this jacket," to discourage mindless consumerism. This counterintuitive honesty didn't sink the company. It forged an unbreakable bond of customer loyalty and created an authentic brand that competitors can only dream of replicating. During this period, Patagonia's revenue surged from $295 million to $1.5 billion, and its customer loyalty metrics dwarfed industry averages. Perhaps the most insidious deception is not what leaders tell us, but what they tell themselves. A 2023 study in organizational behavior and human decision processes revealed that holding a position of power increases self-deception by a staggering 42%. As leaders become more powerful, they become more convinced by their own narratives, even in the face of contradictory evidence. This creates a terrifying feedback loop. Leaders who believe their own hype become more convincing, which reinforces their power and deepens their self-deception even further. The paradox of simplicity. The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. Machiavelli's insight here points to a surprising truth. Genuinely brilliant leaders surround themselves with people who are even smarter than they are. Insecure leaders, on the other hand, surround themselves with sycophants and fools. But this creates a paradox in how we select leaders. A leader who appears intellectually straightforward can sometimes gain a strategic advantage over a more nuanced and thoughtful rival. You can think of it as the beer test in politics. The notion that voters are often drawn to the candidate they'd rather have a casual beer with, rather than the one who seems overly intellectual or complex. This isn't just a political gimmick. It's rooted in deep psychology. Social scientists call it the pratfall effect. The phenomenon where a highly competent person who displays a minor flaw or a touch of simplicity becomes more relatable and likable than someone who appears flawless. When you consider the leaders who have risen quickly in your own field, are they the most rigorous, deep thinkers? Or are they the ones who offer simple, decisive answers with an air of absolute certainty? Have you noticed how we often mistake simplicity for clarity? George W. Bush's folksy communication style is a fascinating case study. Despite degrees from Yale and Harvard Business School, he intentionally adopted a simpler, more direct way of speaking. This carefully cultivated everyman persona resonated deeply with many voters who might have been put off by a more academic presentation. The psychology here is revealing. Human beings have an innate aversion to ambiguity. We crave the comfort of certainty, even when certainty is a fiction. Leaders who provide simple stories and clear-cut answers satisfy this deep psychological need. even when the problems they face are profoundly complex and demand nuanced solutions. A Stanford study that analyzed 952 CEOs found that leaders who used simpler language in their communications were 23% more likely to be hired and received 16% higher starting salaries. However, they were also 31% more likely to underperform in complex business environments where sophisticated thinking was essential. Machiavelli understood this principle well. He advised that a prince should have no other aim or thought than war and its rules and discipline. This isn't just about military strategy. It's a metaphor for focusing on the practical and the straightforward, rather than the abstract or theoretical. This leads to what we might call the complexity trap in leadership. The very individuals who are most capable of navigating the real-world complexities of a leadership role are often the least likely to be chosen for it, precisely because their acknowledgement of that complexity makes them appear less decisive and confident than their simpler-sounding competitors. When empathy becomes a weakness, it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. This iconic Machiavellian maxim reveals a profound and uncomfortable paradox in leadership psychology. While virtues like empathy and compassion are morally admirable, they can, in certain contexts, become strategic liabilities. Machiavelli wasn't arguing for cruelty. He explicitly warned against actions that inspire hatred. Rather, he was recognizing that an excess of empathy can paralyze a leader, preventing them from making difficult but necessary choices. Modern neuroscience lends support to this unsettling idea. A study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that as individuals gain power, they exhibit reduced activity in their mirror neurons, the very brain circuits responsible for empathy, when observing others in distress. The researchers theorized that this dampening of empathy might be an adaptive trait that allows leaders to make tough, dispassionate decisions. Think of a surgeon. If they fully absorbed the emotional weight of every incision, the pain and fear of their patient, they would be unable to perform the life-saving surgery. In the same way, leaders must often make decisions that create short-term pain for the sake of long-term survival or growth. A leader who feels the pain of others too acutely may falter when bold action is required. Does this resonate with difficult choices you've witnessed or had to make? Where too much empathy might have led to a worse outcome for everyone? This creates a deeply troubling dynamic in our leadership pipelines. Individuals with naturally lower levels of empathy, including those with narcissistic tendencies, can more easily project the kind of emotional fortitude and decisiveness we associate with strong leadership. A University of California study found that people scoring higher on narcissism scales were 35% more likely to be selected as leaders in group exercises. Machiavelli saw this connection clearly, writing, "Men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived." A leader with diminished empathy is often more willing to employ deception because they are less troubled by its impact on others. This brings us to the counterintuitive role of virtue. Machiavelli observed, "It is well to seem merciful, faithful, humane, religious, upright, and to be so, but with a mind so framed that should you require not to be so, you may be able and know how to change to the opposite." This isn't to say virtues are worthless, but that their effectiveness is entirely context-dependent. Consider how former German Chancellor Angela Merkel handled the European refugee crisis. Her decision to welcome over 1 million refugees required a delicate balance between humanitarian empathy and the pragmatic realities of integration and public backlash. Had she been driven solely by empathy or solely by pragmatism, the outcome could have been catastrophic. True wisdom lay in knowing when to lead with compassion and when to apply practical constraints. But there are alternatives to this cynical realism. The servant leadership model, pioneered by Robert Greenleaf, proposes that the most effective leaders are those who prioritize the needs of their followers above their own ambition. Costco is a powerful corporate example. Under CEO Jim Sinegal, Costco paid its employees wages 40% higher than the industry average and provided excellent healthcare benefits. The result? Costco's employee turnover is a mere 17% compared to the industry's 44%. And during Sinegal's leadership, Costco's stock outperformed Walmart's by an astonishing 300%. The ultimate challenge, then, isn't choosing between being virtuous and being effective. It's about cultivating the wisdom to know which virtues will serve the greater good in any given situation. As Aristotle, whom Machiavelli had surely read, argued, virtue is not about rigidly following rules, but about applying principles with wisdom to each unique circumstance. The grand leadership paradox. For there is such a difference between how one lives and how one ought to live that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation. This observation from Machiavelli crystallizes the central problem of leadership selection. The qualities that help a person win a leadership contest are often profoundly different from, and sometimes directly opposed to, the qualities that make them an effective leader once they have the job. It's like confusing the actor who plays a brilliant surgeon on screen with the real-life professional who can actually perform the surgery. The actor who best fits our mental image of a surgeon, authoritative, handsome, with a commanding voice, will win the cinematic role. But they would be utterly catastrophic in a real operating room. Similarly, candidates who perform leadership most convincingly often beat out those who would exercise leadership most wisely. How often have you seen the most capable person for a role lose to the most polished performer? This creates what researchers have termed the leadership paradox. The very attributes that fuel a person's rise to power can make them a disastrous steward of that power. The psychology behind this paradox is rooted in our evolutionary past. Studies suggest our brains are wired to respond to primal signals of dominance and confidence, especially in times of threat. This was a useful heuristic in our ancestral environment where physical prowess was key. But it's a liability in the modern world, where collaboration, critical thinking, and innovation are far more valuable than brute dominance. Research from the University of California shows that our criteria for choosing leaders remain disturbingly similar to those of chimpanzees. We are instinctively drawn to individuals who display confidence, physical height, vocal power, and social dominance, traits that have almost zero correlation with effective modern leadership. Machiavelli identified this fundamental conflict between the rulers and the ruled. The powerful, he noted, desire to dominate and oppress. The people, in contrast, have one simple wish: not to be dominated or oppressed. This creates a vicious cycle where our leadership systems may be systematically promoting the wrong people. Those most hungry for power are often the least suited to wield it for the common good. Consider Nelson Mandela, who assumed the presidency of South Africa not through a ruthless pursuit of power, but through the moral authority he earned over 27 years as a political prisoner. His focus on reconciliation over retribution shows how a leader who defies the Machiavellian archetype can achieve transformational change. Likewise, Abraham Lincoln was initially seen by many as awkward and unrefined, yet his deeply thoughtful and empathetic style was precisely what was needed to guide America through its darkest hour. These exceptions prove that while our default settings may favor the narcissist, alternative paths to power are possible, forging a better system. Therefore, it is unnecessary for a prince to have all the good qualities I've enumerated. but it is very necessary to appear to have them. This famously cynical line gets to the heart of Machiavelli's pragmatism. He recognized that in the theater of power, perception often outweighs reality. So the challenge he leaves us is this: if the game is rigged toward appearance, how do we redesign it to reward actual substance? The solution isn't to find perfect leaders, but to build smarter systems that account for our psychological blind spots. Modern organizations are already experimenting with this. Bridgewater Associates, for instance, uses a system of radical transparency, where anyone can challenge leadership, preventing the kind of echo chamber that insulates and reinforces a narcissistic leader. Drawing from this wisdom, we can implement concrete safeguards to protect ourselves. First, prioritize track records over polished performances. Past behavior is a far better predictor of future results than a charismatic interview. Second, institute mandatory trial periods with 360-degree feedback. Before granting permanent authority, gather anonymous input from superiors, peers, and subordinates. Third, create structural firewalls. Separate the power to propose an action from the power to approve it. Concentrating both in one person is a recipe for abuse. Fourth, formally appoint a devil's advocate. Assign someone the specific job of challenging assumptions and questioning the consensus. And finally, enforce term limits and leadership rotation. Power that is never checked or relinquished inevitably corrupts. Ultimately, this points to Machiavelli's most crucial insight. We should focus less on the character of individual leaders and more on the strength of our institutions. James Madison, one of America's founders, applied this very principle when designing the U.S. Constitution. "If men were angels," he wrote, "no government would be necessary." He didn't seek perfect leaders. He built a system of checks and balances designed to function even with imperfect ones. A truly Machiavellian solution in the best sense. Understanding these power dynamics is the first step toward changing them. It's how we learn to distinguish authentic confidence from narcissistic bluster, strategic communication from cynical manipulation, and accessible clarity from lazy thinking. When we educate ourselves on how the game of power is played, we become immune to its worst manipulations. This is what it means to be a truly Machiavellian citizen in the best sense. To understand the dynamics of power well enough to select leaders who will serve the common good, not their own vanity. What aspects of leadership selection have you seen go wrong in your own experience? And have you ever seen a leader rise to power who managed to avoid these traps? I'm genuinely curious to hear your stories. Drop them in the comments below. And if this exploration resonated with you, consider sharing it. Sometimes, the right insight can change how we see everything. If you found value in this deep dive, don't forget to subscribe to Philosophy Bite for more investigations into the hidden patterns that shape our world. Until next time, in a world that often rewards performance, be wise enough to seek out substance.